The morning sun rose like a blade over the horizon, slicing through the mist that hung above the naval training compound in Coronado, California. The air was heavy with salt and tension. Today marked the beginning of one of the toughest joint training programs ever conducted. A collaboration between elite Navy SEAL medics and hand-picked military recruits from across the country. Among the crowd of new faces stood Sarah Coleman, her posture straight, her jaw firm, her eyes locked on the distant flag waving above the command tower. She wasn't the tallest or the strongest recruit there, but there was something in her stillness that drew quiet attention. She didn't fidget, didn't chatter nervously like the others. She just stood silent, observing everything. The other recruits noticed her almost immediately. "Hey, is she mute or something?" One of them whispered, chuckling as he adjusted his gear. Another smirked, probably scared stiff. "This isn't basic training anymore, sweetheart." Sarah didn't react. The wind caught her short, dark hair, brushing it across her face, but she didn't even blink. Her silence wasn't shyness. It was focus. Every sound, the shuffle of boots, the echo of a whistle, the call of an instructor, registered in her mind. When the commanding officer barked, "Fall in," she was the first to snap to formation. Training began brutally, as expected. The recruits were pushed into the cold Pacific surf before sunrise, ordered to crawl through mud, lift logs heavier than their own bodies, and perform push-ups until their arms trembled. The instructors weren't there to motivate, they were there to break. Sarah, however, didn't break. She didn't talk back, didn't groan, didn't even breathe heavy enough for anyone to notice. While others gasped for air, she kept her composure. When she stumbled, she got up. When she bled, she kept moving. The instructors began to notice. Chief Miller, the senior SEAL medic overseeing physical endurance, had seen hundreds of recruits over 2 decades. He'd watched strong men crumble into tears, cocky athletes tap out within hours. But this woman, quiet, unassuming, was different. "Coleman," he called out during a gear drill, watching her sprint across the sand with a full pack. "You know you're allowed to breathe, right?" Sarah nodded once, expression unchanged. Her silence unnerved him. By the end of day 1, several recruits had dropped out. The others sat slumped by the mess tent, shoveling food into their mouths, groaning about blisters and bruises. Sarah ate in silence at the edge of the group. "You trying to prove something, Princess?" A tall Marine named Daniels sneered, limping past her. "You don't talk, you don't complain, you just stare like a robot. You think that makes you tough?" Sarah didn't lift her eyes. She finished her food, stood, and quietly placed her tray away. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Daniels barked, stepping closer. Before things escalated, Chief Miller's voice cut through the air. "Daniels, if you have that much energy left, I can give you another set of log carries." The Marine backed off instantly, muttering under his breath. Sarah walked away without a word. Miller watched her leave. Something about her composure reminded him of the old-school operators. He'd served with men who'd seen combat and learned to conserve every word, every motion. He made a mental note to keep an eye on her. The next morning, the ocean looked deceptively calm. The recruits lined up for the surf torture drill, an infamous SEAL test designed to break both body and mind. "Lock arms. Lie back," the instructor shouted. Sarah found herself shoulder to shoulder with Daniels and 2 others. The freezing waves crashed over their faces, salt water filling their noses and mouths as they struggled to breathe. After only 5 minutes, Daniels yelled, "This is insane. I can't feel my legs." Sarah didn't speak. She kept her jaw clenched, eyes closed, letting the rhythm of the sea guide her breathing. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "The ocean doesn't hate you, Sarah. It tests you. Let it." She stayed still. 10 minutes. 15. The instructors paced the shoreline, shouting, "You can quit any time." All it takes is 3 words. "I give up." One by one, recruits shouted those words. Sarah never did. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, but she held her line. When the whistle finally blew, Miller stepped forward. His eyes swept across the trembling line of survivors and stopped on her. She didn't collapse like the others. She simply stood up, soaked to the bone, and walked back to shore without a word. Miller couldn't help but mutter under his breath, "What the hell are you made of?" Later that afternoon, during a brief rest period, Sarah found herself sitting alone by the barracks, tending to a blister on her heel. The air smelled of wet sand and iron. "Coleman," Miller's voice called from behind. She turned, saluting automatically. "At ease," he said, folding his arms. "You've got pain tolerance off the charts. You ever done endurance work before?" "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Her voice was soft but firm. "Where?" "Home," she answered. He frowned. "You train at home like that?" She gave a faint smile. "My father used to say, don't wait for the world to toughen you up. Start early." Miller studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, whatever he taught you, it's working." "Yes, sir." That was all. No small talk, no smile, no hint of pride. Just acknowledgement. When she walked away, he found himself oddly unsettled, not because she was cold, but because she seemed contained. Like she'd already been through wars no one saw. By the end of the week, Sarah had become a quiet enigma among the recruits. During tactical runs, she was always at the front. During night navigation drills, her compass readings were precise, her instincts razor-sharp. When she failed, she didn't argue. She repeated the task until she succeeded. The instructors respected that. The recruits didn't know how to handle it. One night, while the group rested after a brutal 20-mile march, Daniels and another recruit whispered nearby. "She's not normal," Daniels said. "She doesn't talk, doesn't cry, doesn't even sleep much. It's creepy." "Maybe she's ex-agency or something?" the other replied. "Yeah, right," Daniels scoffed. "If she was that good, she wouldn't be here with us." Sarah lay in her bunk, eyes closed, pretending not to hear. But she did. She always did. At dawn, the final test of the week began an obstacle course known among SEALs as the Wall. It was a mile-long stretch of sheer exhaustion. Rope climbs, mud pits, balance beams, barbed wire crawls, and the infamous final ramp wall, slick with rain. Sarah launched into it with quiet precision. Her muscles burned, her lungs screamed, but she kept her rhythm. When she slipped from the rope and fell into the mud, she climbed again. When her knees bled from crawling under wire, she didn't slow down. Halfway through, Daniels, once the loudest in the group, collapsed beside her. "Can't do it," he gasped. Sarah glanced at him and offered her hand. He stared, shocked. She pulled him up. "Move," she said simply. For the first time, he obeyed her without question. When Sarah reached the final wall, the crowd of recruits and instructors watched silently. Rain poured harder now, turning the ramp into a slippery mirror. She ran, once slipped. Twice slid back down, hands bleeding. Chief Miller stepped closer. "That's enough, Coleman. You're done." But she didn't stop. She backed up, took a deep breath, and charged one last time. Her fingers caught the edge. She grunted, pulling herself up inch by inch until finally she swung her leg over and rolled to the top. For a moment, she just lay there, rain pounding her face. Then, slowly, she stood muddy, bruised, trembling but victorious. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. Even the instructors said nothing. When she climbed down, Chief Miller met her at the finish line. He didn't smile, but there was respect in his eyes. "You've got grit, Coleman," he said quietly. "Keep this up, and you'll surprise a lot of people." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "That's the plan, sir." And with that, she walked past him, every step a silent declaration that she wasn't there to prove her strength to anyone, only to herself. The week's second phase began before dawn, under a gray sky that promised no mercy. The air at the Coronado compound was colder now, sharpened by Pacific winds that whipped sand into the recruits' faces. The first endurance trial loomed a test designed to crush even the strongest minds. They called it Hell Week Light, 5 days of relentless drills, 5 nights of almost no sleep, 5 days to see who truly wanted to stay. The whistle blew at 0400 hours, and silence shattered into chaos. Recruits sprinted down the shoreline, carrying rubber boats on their heads, voices cracking as they screamed cadence. Sarah Coleman was among them, her expression unreadable, her pace steady. She didn't shout. She simply moved, matching the rhythm of the waves with her breathing. Chief Miller stood on the dunes, clipboard in hand, scanning the line. He found her instantly. "Coleman," he muttered under his breath. "Still quiet, huh?" Next to him, an assistant instructor smirked. "Think she's too scared to speak?" Miller shook his head. "No, I think she's too focused to waste breath." By mid-morning, the sun had risen, but warmth never came. The recruits were ordered into the surf again, knees deep, then waist deep, then neck deep in the icy water. "Link arms," shouted the instructor. The line formed, a chain of shivering bodies, the cold biting through every layer of clothing. Sarah clenched her jaw, trying not to gasp as the first wave hit her chest like liquid stone. Around her, recruits whimpered, groaned, cursed under their breath. "Stay strong," Daniels yelled through chattering teeth. "Don't let them see you crack." Sarah didn't respond. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to her father's voice. "Pain is loud, but focus is silent. If you can control your breath, you control the pain." She inhaled through her nose. Slow. Measured. She counted each breath like seconds in a metronome. Miller noticed from shore. "Look at her," he said quietly. "She's regulating." The assistant scoffed. "She's freezing. That's what she's doing." But Miller shook his head. He'd seen that kind of calm before on the faces of combat medics under fire, men and women who'd learned to silence panic and move with precision. Hours bled together. The recruits were soaked, shaking, and stumbling through sand runs with 50-pound logs on their shoulders. Several had already quit. The instructors called them quitter bells, the sound that echoed every time someone rang out. By the third evening, Sarah's eyes were red from exhaustion. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind refused surrender. During a short water break, Daniels, once her biggest critic, collapsed beside her. His voice was hoarse. How do you do it? You don't even look tired." Sarah looked at him, sweat mixing with salt and mud on her face. "Everyone's tired," she said simply. "Some of us just don't show it." He laughed weakly. "You're something else, Coleman." She gave a small nod. "So are you. Keep moving." That was the closest thing to encouragement anyone had heard from her all week. Night fell, and the cold deepened. The recruits were ordered into the tide once more for surf immersion. They had to lie in the shallows as freezing waves crashed over them again and again. Miller crouched beside a lantern on the beach, watching their silhouettes in the dark water. "Time check," one instructor said. "How long we keeping them out?" "Until someone breaks," Miller replied. He kept his eyes fixed on Sarah, her head tilted toward the stars, lips moving slightly, not in prayer, but in counting. The waves pounded over her, yet she stayed motionless. Every time someone screamed or begged for release, she simply held her ground. It wasn't defiance. It was mastery. Finally, when the whistle blew, the recruits stumbled out of the water, trembling like leaves. Sarah walked past Miller, tripping, her eyes distant. "Coleman," he called softly. She stopped. "You ever done breath control training?" he asked. Her reply was calm, almost emotionless. "A little. Who taught you?" "My father," she said. He believed panic was a luxury. Miller's brows furrowed. That wasn't a normal answer. Panic was natural, even necessary at times. But this girl spoke like she'd already faced things worse than this. Day 4 broke them further. Sleep was reduced to 20-minute intervals, barely time to close one's eyes before the whistle shrieked again. Every muscle screamed in rebellion, but Sarah's movements stayed deliberate. During a sandbag carry, her partner fell, twisting his ankle. She didn't hesitate, hoisted the bag herself, and finished the run. An instructor yelled, "Coleman, you think you're a hero?" She didn't reply. The man stormed up to her, shouting in her face, "You answer when I talk to you. Recruit." She met his eyes, calm as still water. "Yes, sir." It wasn't disrespect, it was control. The kind of control that irritated instructors, but secretly impressed them. Chief Miller, watching from a distance, found himself smiling slightly. "She's got fire," he said, "but it burns quiet." By the 5th night, exhaustion had stripped everyone of pride. Voices cracked, knees gave out, tempers flared. Daniels got into a shouting match with another recruit, blaming him for dropping their raft during drills. Fists almost flew until Sarah stepped between them. "Enough," she said firmly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaos like a blade. For a moment, everyone froze. Daniels backed down, his anger replaced with shame. Miller, watching the scene unfold, leaned toward the other medics. "She just stopped a fight with one word." "Leadership," one of them said. "Instinct," Miller corrected. That night, when the recruits were finally allowed a few minutes of rest, Miller walked through the rows of sleeping bodies, flashlight in hand. He stopped when he found Sarah sitting upright, wrapping her feet in gauze. "Coleman," he said quietly, crouching beside her. "Why aren't you asleep?" "Sleep doesn't fix everything, sir," she replied. He noticed her hands calloused, bruised, bleeding at the knuckles, but wrapped neatly. Every bandage perfect. "You do this yourself?" "Yes, sir. Looks professional. My father taught me." Miller nodded slowly. "Your old man sounds like he knew his stuff." Her eyes flickered for a second, a shadow passing through them. "He did. He used to say, 'You can't train pain away. You train how to live with it.'" Miller studied her face, realizing there was grief beneath her control, something buried deep. He decided not to press. "Get some rest, Coleman. Tomorrow's your last test." "Yes, sir." As he walked away, he couldn't shake the thought that this young woman had already endured far more than any of his recruits ever had. The final dawn came without mercy. The recruits were ordered to the obstacle field for a 24-hour continuous endurance test, no breaks. No meals, no excuses. The wind howled across the compound like a living thing. By midday, several had dropped out. Sarah's uniform was torn, her face streaked with salt and grit. Yet her eyes burned steady. Every time she stumbled, she rose again. "Coleman," one of the instructors shouted. "You look like hell." She gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Feels worse, sir." Even he laughed at that. When the final horn sounded, signaling the end of the endurance phase, only 12 recruits remained. Out of nearly 40. The group huddled together on the sand, too exhausted to speak. Miller stepped forward, scanning their faces. His gaze stopped on Sarah, who stood at attention, bloodied, shaking but unbroken. "Coleman," he said finally, front and center. She limped forward, saluted, and waited. "You didn't quit once," he said. "You didn't ask for breaks. You didn't even complain when your partner fell. That kind of discipline doesn't come from training. It comes from something deeper. Where'd you learn it?" Sarah met his gaze. Her answer was simple. "From losing everything that mattered, sir." The air seemed to still. Even the waves quieted for a heartbeat. Miller didn't ask more. He just nodded slowly, eyes thoughtful. "Keep that fire, Coleman. The loud ones fade fast. It's the silent ones who last." She saluted again, then turned back toward the ocean, the same waves that had tried to drown her days ago. They didn't feel like enemies anymore. They felt like witnesses. The ocean was quiet that morning, a strange calm after 5 days of brutal endurance. But everyone at the compound knew peace was only the calm before the next storm. Day 6 began with tactical simulations, urban combat drills, low-light navigation, live weapon handling, and survival maneuvers under pressure. It wasn't about strength anymore. It was about control. The recruits were split into small teams and given a simple order: infiltrate a mock village. Extract a hostage and make it back without being killed. Instructors would simulate gunfire, smoke, and chaos to mimic real battlefield conditions. Chief Miller briefed the recruits personally. "This exercise isn't about who shoots fastest. It's about who keeps their head when things go sideways. People panic when visibility drops. Don't." He looked across the group and found her again. Sarah Coleman, standing at the edge of the formation, still as stone. "Coleman," he said. "You ready?" She nodded. "Always, sir." Something about her tone, quiet, controlled, gave him a strange confidence. She didn't sound like a recruit. She sounded like someone who'd already survived worse. The mission began at dusk. The sky turned purple, shadows stretching long across the training grounds. Floodlights flickered as the recruits moved silently through the mock urban mesa, grid of abandoned buildings and rusted vehicles. Sarah led her small team through an alley, weapon raised, eyes scanning every movement. Her breathing stayed slow and deliberate. Behind her, Daniels whispered, "Left corner movement." Before Sarah could respond, a loud explosion tore through the air. Smoke filled the alley. The blast threw her backward, slamming her leg against a broken metal pipe. The impact sent a sharp pain ripping through her thigh. She hit the ground hard, but didn't scream. Her ears rang. Dust stung her eyes. Somewhere in the haze, a voice yelled, "Medic!" But Sarah's instincts kicked in before the words even registered. She rolled onto her elbows, dragging herself toward a fallen recruit nearby. He was disoriented, struggling to breathe through the smoke. Without hesitation, she pulled him behind a wall, shielding him as debris rained from above. "Stay low," she muttered. "It's just smoke." Her voice was calm, steady enough to slow the man's panic. Chief Miller arrived on the scene within minutes. His radio crackled with updates from every sector. Unit 4 possible injury. Recruit Coleman, status unknown. When he found her, she was kneeling in the dirt, one hand pressed against her own bleeding leg, while helping the other recruit adjust his mask. "Coleman," Miller barked. She turned her head slowly. Her face was streaked with soot, but her eyes were clear. "Recruit down, sir. Minor shock. He'll stabilize if he keeps breathing slow." Miller crouched beside her, scanning the wound. The jagged gash along her thigh was deep, bleeding heavily. "You need evac," he said. "I can still move," she replied. He frowned. "You can barely stand." Her jaw tightened. "Then I'll crawl." Before he could argue, She wrapped a torn strip of her sleeve around her thigh, pulled it tight, and knotted it in one swift motion, a perfect field tourniquet. Miller stared, momentarily speechless. That knot, that speed, it wasn't something they taught in basic training. It was combat-level medical improvisation. "Who taught you that?" he asked quietly. Sarah didn't look at him. "My father." Despite her injury, she refused to leave the field. Miller argued, the instructors debated, but Sarah's resolve was iron. "If I can still hold my rifle, I can still train," she said. Finally, Miller gave in, but not without a warning. "You push too far, and that leg might never heal right." She nodded once. "Understood, sir." For the rest of the drill, she limped through the smoke, relying on her team to cover her, directing them with brief hand gestures and head signals. Even hurt, she was focused, methodical, composed. Every move said one thing: she'd rather bleed in silence than quit in comfort. When the whistle finally blew to end the simulation, Sarah's team returned with the hostage intact. They were exhausted, covered in grime, but they'd completed the mission faster than any other group. Miller approached, his medical bag slung over his shoulder. "Sit down, Coleman, now." She hesitated, then complied. As he cleaned the wound, the other recruits gathered nearby, whispering in awe. The tough ones who'd mocked her days earlier now looked at her differently, some with respect, others with guilt. Daniels crouched beside her. "You didn't even yell when that thing hit you. Thought you were dead for a second." Sarah gave a faint smile. "I was too busy thinking." "Thinking about what?" "How not to die." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're insane." "Maybe," she replied. But even as she spoke, the edges of her vision blurred. Pain, delayed by adrenaline, came roaring back. Miller noticed immediately. "Hey," he said gently. "Stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered. "I'm fine." "No, you're not. I've had worse." Her words were slurred, but she stayed conscious. Miller wrapped the wound tightly, sealing it with surgical tape, and helped her onto a stretcher despite her protests. "I said I can walk," she muttered. "Yeah," he said. "And I said I don't care?" In the medical bay, fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Sarah sat on the examination table, her leg propped up while Miller stitched the wound. His hands were steady, his voice calm. "You've got a deep tear, but no tendon damage. You'll need rest, though." Sarah stayed silent, eyes fixed on the ceiling. After a few minutes, he asked quietly, "You ever served before?" "No, sir." "You sure about that?" "Yes, sir." He gave a half-smile. "Because you move like someone who's been under fire." She didn't reply. Her breathing slowed again, steady as the ticking clock on the wall. "Your father," he said finally. "He train you himself?" Sarah's lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched long enough that Miller thought she wouldn't answer. Then, softly, she said, "He trained me to survive, not to speak." Miller frowned slightly. "What happened to him?" She looked away. "He never came home." The room fell quiet again. Miller didn't ask more. The look in her eyes said everything, the kind of loss that doesn't fade, only hardens. Later that evening, Miller met with the other instructors in the command office. The walls buzzed faintly with radio chatter, the smell of coffee thick in the air. "She's something else," one of them said. "That injury should have put her down." "She refused morphine," Miller added. "Said she didn't want to dull her senses." Another instructor raised an eyebrow. "Refused painkillers? That's not bravery. That's madness." Miller shook his head. "No, that's control. And I've only ever seen that kind of control in two places: combat medics and people who've already lived through trauma." They all looked at him, waiting. He set down his mug. "She's hiding something," But it's not dishonesty. It's pain. The kind you don't brag about. Back in her quarters, Sarah sat on her bunk, carefully rewrapping her wound. Every movement was deliberate, mechanical. The pain pulsed through her leg, but she didn't wince. Daniels knocked lightly on the frame. "You good?" She glanced up. "I will be." "You're crazy, you know that?" "Maybe." He hesitated. "You saved my life today. I owe you." "You don't owe me anything," she said, tightening the bandage. "We're supposed to watch each other's backs." Daniels scratched his head awkwardly. "Still, you didn't have to drag me out of that smoke. Could have gotten yourself killed." Sarah looked up then, her gaze steady but soft. "I've already lost someone once. I don't lose people twice." He didn't ask who. He just nodded. When he left, Sarah leaned back against the cold wall, exhaling slowly. Her leg throbbed, but her mind was calm. The silence in the barracks felt different now, not isolation, but control. Somewhere outside, the ocean roared faintly against the shore. To her, it sounded less like noise and more like a heartbeat, a reminder that pain was temporary. But purpose wasn't. Chief Miller passed by her bunk before lights out, checking in quietly. "How's the leg?" "Functional. That's not an answer. It'll hold." He chuckled under his breath. "You ever stop fighting?" She met his gaze. "Only when there's nothing left worth fighting for." Miller paused, then nodded slowly. "You keep that up, Coleman, and people are going to start believing you're made of steel." She looked away, a flicker of something grief, maybe crossing her eyes. "Steel breaks too, sir. It just takes longer." The rain fell hard that morning, cold, relentless, and uninviting. It drenched the training grounds into a slick battlefield of mud and puddles, but nobody was excused. SEAL training didn't pause for weather, weakness, or wounds. Sarah stood in the downpour, her injured leg wrapped tightly beneath her fatigues. The pain was constant now, like a dull heartbeat under the surface. But she didn't flinch. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Chief Miller's whistle cut through the storm. "You've got 10 minutes to get through the obstacle course loaded. Move!" The recruit sprinted forward. Sarah took one step, felt the pull in her thigh, and nearly lost her balance. The mud clung to her boots, each step heavier than the last. Daniels looked back, his brow furrowed. "You sure you can do this?" He shouted over the rain. Sarah's voice was calm. "I'm doing it." She limped forward, teeth clenched, pushing through the course. Every rope climb felt like dragging her body through glass. Every jump sent a shock of pain up her leg. But she didn't stop. At the wall climb, she hesitated 8 feet of slick wood with no traction. Her legs screamed when she jumped, her arms trembling as she clung to the top. Miller watched from below, eyes narrowed. "Coleman?" He barked. "Drop it if you can't hold it." "I can hold it," she said, her voice flat but firm. And she did. She pulled herself over the wall, fell into the mud on the other side, and kept crawling forward until she crossed the finish line. By the time the last recruit finished, her hands were raw and her leg was bleeding again through the soaked bandage. Miller called her aside. "You're reopening that wound every time you push like this," he said. "I know." "Then stop pushing." She met his gaze. "You told us quitting's not an option." He sighed, frustrated but impressed. "There's a difference between strength and stubbornness." "Maybe," she replied, "but sometimes stubbornness is all you have left." Miller looked at her for a long moment, then simply nodded. "You're impossible, Coleman. I've been told." That night, while the others rested, Sarah stayed behind in the empty training shed. The rain drummed softly on the roof as she sat sharpening her knife, a rhythmic, focused motion that kept her mind from wandering too far. Every scrape of the blade, brought back flashes of memory. Her father's voice, calm and low. Pain is proof you're still alive, Sarah. Don't fear it. Use it. She remembered sitting across from him at their kitchen table when she was young, the light from the single lamp catching his uniform's insignia. He never talked about the missions, only the lessons. Survival isn't about strength, he'd said once. It's about control. People who panic die first. People who endure live to try again. Sarah blinked the memory away. The blade gleamed under the dim light. Somewhere deep inside her, she still chased his approval, even now, years after he never came home. The next morning, Miller entered the infirmary to find Sarah already awake, sitting on the exam table with her leg exposed. The wound looked angry, red and swollen. "You again," he muttered, setting down his medical kit. "You ever sleep?" She shrugged. "Sometimes." He examined the stitches. "You're on the edge of infection. You should have told me. I didn't want to be benched." He shook his head. "You're the kind of recruit that makes medics gray early." When he began cleaning the wound, she didn't so much as twitch. Not even when he applied antiseptic. "Doesn't that hurt?" he asked. "It's just pain." He looked up at her, studying her expression. "You say that like pain's a friend." "In a way it is," she replied softly. "It reminds me I'm still fighting." Miller paused. "You talk like someone who's lost more than she should have." Sarah didn't respond, but her silence said enough. That afternoon, the recruits gathered for water drills, a brutal endurance test in the cold ocean surf. The waves crashed with a fury that would have made most civilians turn back, but the trainees charged in without hesitation. "Hold formation," Miller shouted. "Lock arms, ride the wave." The recruits formed a tight line, shoulders pressed together. The first wave hit hard. Sarah felt the current drag her backward, salt stinging her wound. Daniels grunted beside her, gripping tighter. Another wave came, taller this time. It slammed into her chest, stealing her breath. For a second, she was under just cold, crushing silence. She opened her eyes underwater. The light shimmered above her, distorted and distant. Then she saw someone next to her, flailing, pulled away from the group. Without thinking, she pushed upward, broke the surface, and dove toward him. "Daniels!" she yelled, reaching through the foam. He was being dragged by the undertow, panic setting in. She caught his arm and kicked hard, ignoring the pain shooting through her leg. Inch by inch, she pulled him toward the others. Miller saw the commotion and sprinted into the surf, diving in to help. Together, they dragged Daniels to shore. The recruit coughed violently, gasping for air. Miller turned to Sarah, drenched, bleeding, barely standing. "You all right?" She nodded weakly. He needed help. Miller shook his head in disbelief. "You just saved a man from drowning with a half-healed leg." Sarah managed a small, tired smile. Guess stubbornness paid off. Back at the barracks, Daniels approached her, still shaken. "You're insane, Coleman. That current could have killed you." She sat quietly on her bunk. "You'd have done the same." He laughed bitterly. "Not with a busted leg. I wouldn't. You don't quit, do you?" She looked up at him, eyes steady. "I did once." The words hung in the air. Daniels didn't know what to say, and before he could ask, she looked away. Never again. Later that night, Miller stopped by her bunk again. He carried a small folder in his hand, a confidential file. "I looked into your records," he said quietly. "Your father, Lieutenant Marcus Coleman, Navy EOD, died in action." Sarah didn't look surprised. "You went digging. I wanted to understand why you're here." She met his gaze. "I'm here because he couldn't finish what he started." Miller frowned. "You think this is about redemption?" No, she said simply. It's about remembering who I am when things hurt. He sat down on the edge of her bunk. You know, there's a thin line between honoring someone's memory and letting it consume you. I walk that line every day, she replied. He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're not like the others. Most of them are here to prove something. You're here to be something. She didn't respond, but for the first time, there was a faint glimmer of emotion behind her calm something almost vulnerable. In the following days, her injury healed enough for her to return to full duty. But the whispers around camp changed tone. She wasn't the quiet recruit anymore. She was the one who bled, fought, and didn't stop. Miller noticed how the others began to follow her lead. Even without speaking much, she commanded respect. She'd become a symbol of endurance. During an evening exercise, he called the group together. Pain teaches, he said, his voice loud over the crashing waves. But endurance transforms. Some of you fight pain. Others, like Coleman, make it their ally. Sarah stood silent at the back of the formation, her face shadowed by the fading sun. She didn't smile, but she didn't need to. The pride wasn't in her expression, it was in her stance. That night, before lights out, Miller stopped by once more. You ever wonder what your father would say if he saw you now? Sarah paused, then whispered, He'd tell me to keep my head down. And he'd tell me I did good. Miller nodded. He'd be right on both counts. As he turned to leave, Sarah finally spoke again softly, but with meaning. Chief? He looked back. Thanks for not letting me quit. He smiled faintly. You never needed me for that, Coleman. And for the first time since she arrived, Sarah felt something she hadn't in a long time peace, even if just for a moment. The sun rose red that morning, casting the base in a hazy, golden glow that felt almost deceptive after weeks of storms and chaos. The ocean was calm again, but Sarah knew better than to trust calm waters. Calm had a way of hiding the undertow. The recruits were granted a rare half-day break, but rest wasn't in her nature. While others laughed in the mess hall or caught up on sleep, Sarah sat on the docks, her booted feet hanging over the edge as she stared at the horizon. The rhythmic crash of waves reminded her of the sound she grew up with, the constant hum of her father's world. Navy bases, ship decks, early morning drills. She could still remember the way he'd stand by the water, hands behind his back, saying, This ocean will take everything from you if you don't learn to respect it. She'd been 12 when he didn't come home. The official report said his unit hit an IED during an underwater demolition mission. Fatal injuries, the report read. Quick death. But Sarah never believed the word quick. She remembered the knock on the door, her mother's scream, the folded flag. She remembered the silence that followed days of unanswered questions, of staring at his medals, and wondering what any of it meant if he wasn't coming back. From that day on, silence became her language. Words had failed her once, so she stopped trusting them. Chief Miller found her there on the dock, sitting still as stone. Figured I'd find you here, he said, approaching with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. You're not much for downtime, huh? She took the cup, nodding in quiet thanks. Miller sat beside her, the wood creaking beneath his weight. For a long time, they just listened to the ocean. You know, he began, I've trained a lot of recruits. The loud ones burn out. The cocky ones break. The quiet ones like you, they scare me. Sarah glanced at him. Why's that? Because you don't talk until it matters. And when you finally do, it's usually because something's about to change. She looked away, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. Maybe I've said too much already. He took a sip of coffee. Or not enough. They sat in silence again. Miller studied her profile-sharp jawline, steady eyes, the kind of focus that came from pain, turned into discipline. I read your father's file, he said finally. He was one of the best. Sarah nodded once. He was. You ever talk about him? Not much to say. That's not true, he said. There's always something to say. You just have to want to say it. She exhaled slowly. He believed in strength, but not in comfort. Said comfort makes people weak. Miller raised an eyebrow. And you agree? She turned to face him fully. I think comfort makes people forget how to survive. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. That's not wrong. But comfort isn't weakness, Coleman. It's recovery. She didn't respond. Recovery wasn't a word that ever fit in her world. Later that day, Miller called the recruits to the field for a surprise endurance test. A long-distance ruck march under the blazing sun. Full gear, no rest. It wasn't punishment. It was a test of will. Sarah's leg was healing, but the scar tissue burned with every step. The heat was merciless, sweat dripping down her spine. Yet, her expression never changed. Daniels, walking beside her, kept glancing over. You ever feel pain like the rest of us? Every second, she said. He laughed between breaths. Could have fooled me. Pain's just a signal, she replied. You decide what it means. By mile 7, recruits began to falter. Miller kept his eyes on them, but his attention drifted to Sarah. Even with her limp, she stayed steady. When one of the recruits collapsed, she dropped her pack without hesitation and helped him up. Keep moving, she said firmly. You stop, it gets harder. Her tone wasn't emotional. It was commanding. The kind of voice you followed without question. When they finally reached the end point hours later, Miller blew his whistle. The recruits dropped to the ground, panting. Sarah stood last, her shoulders squared, chest heaving, eyes distant. Miller walked over. You ever stop proving something? Not until I know who I'm proving it to. And who's that? She hesitated. Him. He didn't need her to say the name. He already knew. That night, the storm returned. Wind howled through the barracks, lightning cracking across the horizon. Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories clawing their way back through the dark. She saw her father's face again bloodied, half submerged in her nightmares. A dream she'd had 100 times. Only this time, he spoke. Why are you still fighting, Sarah? She whispered back in her sleep, because you did. The dream shifted. The blast. The water turning red. Then silence. She jolted awake, breathing hard, sweat clinging to her skin. For the first time since arriving at the base, tears burned her eyes. She sat up quickly, trying to steady herself, but the ache inside her chest refused to quiet. When the rain eased, she left her bunk and went outside, barefoot, walking across the soaked dirt. She ended up by the medical tent, where a faint light glowed inside. Miller was still awake, writing reports at his desk. He looked up as she entered. Can't sleep? He asked. She shook her head. He gestured for her to sit. Talk to me. She hesitated, then said quietly, You ever feel like you're chasing ghosts? Miller leaned back. Every day. Some of them wear faces. Some just wear memories. Sarah looked down at her hands. I thought being here would make the noise stop. The guilt, the questions. But it doesn't. Because it's not supposed to, he said softly. Training doesn't erase what haunts you. It teaches you how to live with it. Her voice trembled slightly. He died doing what I'm trying to do. How do I live with that? You live because of that, Miller said firmly. Not instead of it. She went quiet for a long time, staring at the floor. Then, in a rare moment of openness, she whispered, He told me once that silence was power. But I think I've been hiding behind it. Miller nodded slowly. Silence is powerful. Sure, but it's not healing. Sometimes you have to let the world hear what broke you. Otherwise, it keeps winning. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wet but steady. You ever lose someone? He smiled faintly. 2 brothers. Both in uniform. Did it get easier? He shook his head. No, you just learned to breathe through it. The rain outside softened to a drizzle. For the first time, Sarah didn't rush back to her bunk. She stayed, listening to the soft hum of the medical tent, the smell of antiseptic and ocean salt mixing in the air. Miller poured her a cup of water. You know, he said, when I first met you, I thought you were running from something. She nodded. I was? And now? She looked toward the dark horizon beyond the tent flap. Now, I think I'm running toward something. I just don't know what yet. Miller smiled. That's progress, Coleman. She managed a small laugh, quiet but real. The next morning, when the recruits lined up for inspection, Sarah stood taller. Her limp was still there, the scar visible beneath her rolled cuff, but her eyes were clearer, now focused, not haunted. Miller noticed. As he passed her row, he paused briefly. You look different today. She smirked faintly. Maybe I finally slept. He gave her a knowing look. Or maybe you finally stopped running. That day marked a shift. Sarah wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to belong. The other recruits followed her lead instinctively. She helped the weakest during drills, shared techniques without arrogance, and even allowed herself to laugh once in a while. But beneath it all, the fire in her never dimmed. It only burned steadier, cleaner. The kind of fire that doesn't just survive pain, but transforms it. The air was cold before dawn, the kind of chill that bit through skin and bone. No one knew exactly what was coming that day, only that Chief Miller had called it the Crucible, a final test designed to break even the toughest recruits before they could move forward. Sarah stood among the group, silent as ever, her eyes forward, her gear packed tight. The scar on her leg still ached when she shifted her weight, but she ignored it. Pain had long ago become part of her uniform. Miller's voice cut through the darkness. You've all made it farther than most. But today isn't about distance. It's about what's left when you have nothing left. He walked down the line, his boots sinking slightly into the wet sand. You'll move through 6 miles of terrain. Cold water. Live simulation fire. Team extractions. You fail to help your unit. You fail the test. Daniels muttered under his breath. Guess we're about to find out who we really are. Sarah's lips twitched in a faint, humorless smile. You already know. The question is whether you can stay that person when it hurts. The whistle blew. They plunged into the ocean first, chest-deep water colder than steel. Every breath Sarah took felt like glass. Waves slammed against them as they dragged a weighted raft through the surf. Keep it steady. Miller yelled from shore. You lose that raft, you lose everything. The current pulled hard. A smaller recruit near the front began to falter. Sarah moved forward, grabbing the rope beside him. Breathe. Follow the pull, not against it. He looked at her, teeth chattering. I can't feel my hands. Then feel the mission, she said. The phrase sounded strange even to her, something her father used to say during training drills. He'd always taught her that survival wasn't about sensation. It was about purpose. Together, they dragged the raft ashore, collapsing in the sand, gasping. Miller's voice roared over the wind. Up, this isn't a vacation. Move to extraction drills. By midday, exhaustion had set in. The recruits were caked in sand, shivering, soaked to the bone. The next task was a team carry, moving a 200-pound dummy across a mile of uneven ground. Sarah took one end of the stretcher, her arms trembling from fatigue. Daniels took the other. Each step was agony, the sand shifting underfoot, the wind slicing across their faces. Halfway through, Daniels stumbled. The stretcher tilted dangerously, nearly dropping their load. Sarah caught it with a grunt, the strain shooting through her leg. "You're bleeding again," Daniels rasped. She didn't look down. "Keep moving. You're gonna tear that leg open. Then I'll sew it shut later." He stared at her in disbelief, but the fire in her eyes silenced any argument. They pushed on, step after step, until they reached the checkpoint. Miller stood waiting. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes lingered on Sarah's leg, the bandage darkened with blood. "You all right, Coleman?" "I'm operational. That's not what I asked." She met his gaze steadily. "Sir, with respect, you told us this test was about what's left when we have nothing. This is what's left." Miller's jaw tightened. For the briefest second, he almost smiled, not out of amusement, but respect. "Then let's see how much you've got left." The final test was a solo endurance run, 3 miles through the mud trails, carrying a 40-pound pack. No team, no backup. Just willpower against the elements. As she started, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time that day. The light reflected off the puddles, blinding in patches, making the trail harder to read. Each step drove pain through her leg, but she didn't slow. The rhythm of her breathing became mechanical. Inhale, exhale, step, push. Half a mile in, her vision started to blur. Her lungs burned, her body screamed. But deep inside, beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a memory. Her father's voice. "You don't stop because it hurts, Sarah. You stop when the mission is done." She whispered the words to herself like a mantra. When the mission is done. At mile 2, she stumbled. Her knee hit the ground hard. The pain exploded up her thigh, white-hot and unbearable. For a moment, she couldn't move. She pressed her palms into the mud, breathing hard. The world spun. She could hear Miller's voice, echoing somewhere in her head. "Don't let pain define you." And then she pushed herself up. One slow, deliberate movement at a time. When she crossed the finish line, she didn't collapse. She stood still, chest heaving, covered in mud, her uniform torn. The others stared, exhausted themselves, but in awe. Miller approached slowly, studying her. "Coleman, what in God's name keeps you going?" Sarah wiped mud from her face. "You told us not to stop." He shook his head. "That's not what I mean. I've seen Marines break with less. SEALs fold under less pressure. You don't flinch. You don't complain. You don't even react. So I'll ask you again, what trained you to survive like this?" The question hit her harder than the pain. She looked at him for a long moment, the answer caught somewhere between past and present. Finally, she said quietly, "Life." Miller frowned. "Be specific." She exhaled slowly. "When my father died, my mother fell apart. The world didn't stop for us. Bills, people, noise, it kept moving. I learned that if you want to keep up, you don't have the luxury of breaking down. You learn to function in silence." Miller's voice softened. "That's not training, Coleman. That's survival." She looked away. "What's the difference?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That night, the recruits gathered around the fire pit for their debrief. No lectures, no punishments. Just silence and the crackle of flames. Miller stood before them, his gaze moving across the group. "You all earned something today, not just endurance, but perspective. Some of you found out how much pain you can take. Some found out where you break. But one of you," he turned toward Sarah, "showed us what it means to turn pain into purpose." The others glanced at her, murmuring. She didn't react, but a flicker of warmth crossed her features. Miller continued, "Coleman, When I asked what trained you, you said life. That's not an excuse. That's a lesson. What you've been through, most people never recover from. But you didn't just recover. You built something out of it. Discipline, clarity, focus. That's not learned. That's forged. Sarah's throat tightened slightly. She didn't expect praise. It almost felt foreign. After dismissing the others, Miller approached her privately. The firelight flickered against his uniform. You ever think about what comes next after this? He asked. She looked into the flames. I don't think that far ahead. You should, he said. Because after what I saw today, you've got the makings of something rare. Someone who doesn't just survive, but leads. She frowned. I'm not a leader. You think leadership's about talking? It's not. It's about being unshakable when others fall apart. She was quiet for a moment. That's what my father used to say. Miller smiled faintly. Then maybe he knew something we're just starting to understand. Hours later, the camp was asleep. Sarah sat alone by the dying fire, staring into the embers. Her body ached, her wound throbbed, but her mind felt clear, clearer than it had in years. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn coin, her father's challenge coin. She turned it between her fingers, the engraved motto barely visible now. The only easy day was yesterday. She smiled softly. Guess you were right, Dad. A gust of wind blew across the coals, sending sparks spiraling upward into the dark. Sarah watched them fade, thinking how much they reminded her of people, bright for a moment, then gone, but still leaving light behind. For the first time, she didn't feel like a ghost chasing memories. She felt like someone building a future, one step, one scar, one breath at a time. The following morning dawned gray and muted, clouds pressing down like a weight over the base. The aftershocks of the SEAL test still lingered, not just in the muscles of the recruits, but in their minds. Sarah woke before the first whistle, lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Her leg ached, the scar throbbing from every twist and shift during the previous day's brutal march. Her arms and back burned too, but it was the storm inside her mind that made her sit upright. She felt the emptiness, the hollow echo of everything she had endured, the ghosts of what she had lost, and the small, almost forbidden spark of pride for what she had survived. Breakfast was silent. Most of the recruits were still sore and drained. Some whispered about the previous day's endurance drills, the waves, the mud, the impossible solo run. Sarah took her place at the table, eyes forward, chewing slowly. Daniels leaned over. You sure you're human? I mean, we were all miserable yesterday. And you just kept going. I don't have the option not to, she replied flatly. He frowned. That sounds terrible. She shrugged, looking down at her plate. Terrible is when you can't get back up. I've learned to stand anyway. He glanced at her scarred leg. Does it ever hurt? Yes, she said simply. Then she looked away, the conversation over before it began. The day's training consisted of an indoor simulation, hostile territory infiltration with timed responses. A small team would enter a mock compound, neutralize threats, and extract a high-value target. Sarah was paired with Daniels, Red, and two others. The team moved swiftly, navigating low-light corridors and narrow stairwells. Her leg throbbed with every turn, every jump, but she compensated with precision. Her movements were calculated, economical, each step deliberate. Midway through the drill, an unexpected simulated ambush threw the team into chaos. A flashbang detonated nearby, blinding and disorienting. The other recruits froze. The target panicked. Sarah reacted instinctively, pushing the target down, signaling the others with hand gestures she had perfected over days of silent leadership. She moved Reed out of harm's way and drew attention away from Daniels, who was momentarily pinned by the simulated gunfire. The team finished the drill successfully, but Miller's eyes were on her the whole time. He had been monitoring from a vantage point above the training floor. When they emerged, he walked directly toward her, his face unreadable. "You keep everyone alive without a word," he said quietly. "Do you realize how rare that is?" "I'm just doing my job," she replied. Miller's gaze lingered. "No, Coleman. You're doing more than a job. You're making everyone else better, faster, smarter, calmer." She shrugged again, a protective shield going up automatically. "They'd survive without me." "Maybe," Miller said slowly, "but they wouldn't thrive. That's the difference. And you," he paused, his voice softer now, "you thrive in the storm." That night, after the debrief, Sarah returned to her quarters alone. The physical exhaustion of the day was heavy, but the emotional weight was heavier. She had always hidden behind silence, behind endurance, behind her carefully controlled composure. But for the first time, she felt the storm inside her begin to surface: grief, pride, fear, and longing, all mingling in a way that made her chest tight. She sat by the small window, staring at the stars. The memory of her father's last mission returned with vivid clarity. She remembered the briefing, the orders, the courage he'd worn like armor. And she remembered his absence afterward, the void it left in her life. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She clenched her fists, pressed them to her eyes, and inhaled sharply. Somewhere outside, the wind whispered through the barracks. For once, it didn't feel like the world was pressing down on her. It felt like it was listening. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Coleman?" Miller's voice. She wiped her eyes and stood. "Yes, sir?" He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Couldn't sleep either?" She shook her head. "I'm fine." "Sure you are," he said, not unkindly. He moved closer, stopping short of invading her space. "You don't have to hide it here." "Not from me." Sarah's back stiffened. She wasn't used to this. People rarely saw her cracks. She had learned long ago that vulnerability was a liability in her world. "I'm not hiding," she said finally, her voice quieter than intended. Miller studied her, his expression softening. "You are. And it's exhausting, isn't it?" She didn't answer. "You've carried more than anyone should," he continued. "And you've done it without complaint. But it doesn't mean you have to carry it alone." Something in his words struck a chord. For a moment, Sarah let herself imagine a world where silence wasn't survival, where someone could see her pain, and it wouldn't destroy her. She started, then stopped. Miller nodded. "Take your time. You've been trained to survive every battle except the one within. And that one? That's the hardest." She exhaled, the first real release of breath in weeks. "I've been afraid," she admitted softly. Miller's eyes softened. "Afraid of what?" "Of letting go. Of showing weakness. Of becoming human." He said nothing, letting the words hang. Then he placed a hand gently on her shoulder, brief, grounding. "There's a difference between weakness and being honest about what you feel. You'll learn it in time. Trust me." Sarah stared at him, absorbing the rare kindness, the unusual understanding. For a moment, she felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, relief. The next day, training continued, but Sarah was different. She didn't talk about what Miller had said, and the others noticed nothing overt. Yet she moved with a lighter step, her focus sharpened, but her demeanor slightly softer. Daniels noticed it first. "You look calmer," he whispered during an obstacle drill. "I'm fine," she said, though her lips curved faintly in acknowledgement. Even Miller noticed. Watching her during the drills, he saw something new, not a weakening of her edge, but a channeling of the storm inside her, the way she could now act without the constant, silent pressure of her past guiding every move. That evening, Sarah returned to the dock where she had spent so many mornings alone. She took out her father's challenge coin, turning it in her hand. The fire from the sunset glinted on its worn surface. "I survived," she whispered. "Not because I was strong, not because I was unbreakable, but because I finally let the storm be part of me." And for the first time, she didn't feel alone. Miller's words echoed in her mind. You don't have to carry it alone. She allowed herself a small smile. The storm within was still there, still raging, but now it felt like an ally, not an enemy. Hours later, as the camp settled into the night, Miller returned to check on her. She was sitting quietly by the fire pit, staring into the embers. "You've changed," he said softly. "I guess," she replied. "You know, Coleman," he continued, "I've seen a lot of tough recruits. I've never seen one like you. You carry pain, loss, fear, and somehow you turn it into action, leadership, endurance. I don't know many people who could do that." She looked up at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I don't know if I'm proud of it, or if it's just survival. Maybe both," he said, his voice low. "And maybe that's enough for now." The wind stirred again, carrying the scent of the ocean. Sarah breathed deeply, letting the memories, the pain, the lessons, and the faintest sense of hope wash over her. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full spectrum of her storm, the grief, the pride, the endurance, and still remain unbroken. The morning was sharp with frost, the kind of cold that bites through layers and settles into bones. Even the seasoned SEAL instructors shivered under their thick jackets as they prepared the final evaluation. Sarah laced her boots slowly, methodically, as if every knot tied could steady the storm within her. Her leg was fully healed, the scar now a silent reminder of everything she had endured. Her eyes, sharp and clear, scanned the training field where the final obstacle course awaited, a series of challenges designed to push every recruit to their limits. Chief Miller approached, his expression unreadable. "Today decides it all. Finish strong, or don't finish at all." Sarah nodded silently. The whistle blew, echoing across the field. Recruits surged forward. Sarah followed in precise, calculated movements, her body fluid and deliberate. She leapt over walls, crawled under nets, and climbed ropes as if her limbs were extensions of her will, not her body. Halfway through, the unexpected happened. An ambush simulation exploded, smoke, loud gunfire, and chaos. Most recruits faltered, stumbling, panicked. Sarah's instincts kicked in. She slid into cover, assessed the enemy positions, and signaled her team without words. Hand gestures, a tilt of her head, eye movements. She moved Daniels out of the line of fire, helped a collapsing recruit, and coordinated extraction like a conductor guiding an orchestra through a storm. Miller observed from above, jaw tight. He'd seen strategy, skill, and endurance before, but this was something else. When the smoke cleared and the simulation ended, Sarah's team was intact. The others were exhausted, shaking, sweat and mud caked on every inch of them. Sarah stood tall, breathing steadily, her face calm, composed, almost eerily serene. Later, the SEAL medic, Lieutenant Harper, approached her. His eyes scanned her uniform, noting every detail, sweat-streaked hair, scars, the faint bruises along her arms. "You're remarkable," he said carefully, clipboard in hand. "You moved through that chaos like you'd done it 1,000 times." Sarah met his gaze quietly. "Training." He raised an eyebrow. "Specific training. You've been through more than what we've put these recruits through. Where? How? She didn't answer immediately. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken truths. Harper leaned in slightly. I mean it. Your reactions, your precision, the way you manage pain, stress, and coordination under fire. You're beyond standard Navy SEAL prep. I need to know what prepared you for this. Sarah's eyes flickered, a storm contained, but visible to anyone patient enough to watch. Life, she said softly. Harper frowned. Life? She nodded, letting the word linger. Everything that happened before this. Everything I survived. Every loss, every wound, every fear I learned to endure. That's my training. That's why I'm here. Harper blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. He wasn't used to recruits who carried real battle scars, emotional and physical, and still performed at this level. Miller walked up then, his presence commanding attention. She's telling you the truth, he said, voice low. Most people never survive what she has. And even fewer could perform under the same conditions without breaking. Harper's eyes widened. I had no idea. Sarah shifted slightly. Her silence, once her armor, now revealed a strength Harper could barely comprehend. Every measured movement, every precise decision, every silent command she had given during drills was a product of years of surviving a life most could not endure. You're? Not like anyone else, Harper admitted finally. I don't think I've ever seen anyone. He stopped, searching for words. You shocked me. Honestly, I didn't believe it was possible. Sarah looked at him, expression calm but unwavering. Shocking isn't my goal. Survival is. Leadership is. Doing what's necessary. Harper nodded slowly, taking in the scars, the poise, the quiet fire in her eyes. And yet, you've done more than survive. You've led, you've protected, you've inspired. I don't think words can explain that. Miller cleared his throat, his tone sharp now, cutting through the weight of the moment. Coleman, report. She took a deep breath, her hands tightening into fists briefly before releasing. Sir, I'm fully operational. All tasks complete. Team intact. Mission objectives achieved. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You didn't just complete it. You excelled where most would fail. The other recruits, still recovering from the simulation, looked at her in awe. Some whispered, others stared openly. The realization settled. Sarah wasn't merely enduring the training. She was rewriting what it meant to survive and lead. Harper stepped back, shaking his head. I have to see this on paper. I need records, details, training history. Sarah's lips twitched faintly. There's nothing to show. Just life, experience, hard lessons. You survived. Harper began, then paused, a quiet respect settling over his words. You trained in ways we can't replicate. That's extraordinary. Her expression softened just slightly. Extraordinary doesn't exist. Only necessary. Miller's eyes met hers. He could see it now, the culmination of weeks of observation, testing, endurance, and silent leadership. This was more than a recruit. This was someone forged in the fire of life itself. The day continued with awards and assessments, but Sarah's accomplishment loomed larger than any medal or checklist. Her teammates began to approach her quietly, asking questions, seeking advice, silently acknowledging her mastery. Daniels approached cautiously, still awestruck. Coleman, I don't know how you do it. How you stay calm. How you handle everything. She looked at him, calm, steady, almost serene. You focus on what matters. Ignore what doesn't. Endure what you must. He frowned. That's it? Just endure? That's all anyone can do, she replied simply. Endure, adapt, survive. The words were deceptively simple. But after seeing her in action, Daniels understood their weight. That evening, the recruits gathered around the barracks fire one last time before the next phase of their training. The glow reflected in Sarah's eyes, and for the first time, she allowed herself a small measure of pride, not arrogance, not boastful, but a quiet acknowledgement of how far she had come. Miller approached, standing near the edge of the circle. Coleman, he said, his tone solemn but approving. I've watched many trainees, but very few stand out like you. Today, you've done more than survive. You've led, you've inspired, and you've changed the standard. You've set an example that others will follow for years to come. Sarah didn't smile. She didn't need to. The acknowledgement was enough. Harper, standing behind Miller, finally spoke again. I still can't believe it. You're beyond what I thought possible. I've seen people break under less. How? How are you prepared for all this? Sarah met his gaze, steady and unwavering. Prepared? I wasn't. I survived. I learned. Every scar, every loss, every failure. It became my guide. I don't need manuals. I don't need instructors. I just live through it. Harper shook his head in disbelief, finally understanding. That's astonishing. You've turned survival into mastery. She nodded slightly. Not mastery, necessity. Silence fell over the group, not awkward, but reverent. Words couldn't capture what they had just witnessed. Sarah's quiet strength, honed by life itself, had surpassed every expectation. That night, alone once more by the dock, Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe fully. The stars reflected on the water, glittering like distant fires. She pulled her father's challenge coin from her pocket, feeling the smooth edges under her fingers. She whispered softly, I made it, Dad. I didn't just survive. I became what you wanted me to be. The wind carried the faint sound of waves crashing against the shore. It seemed to respond, gentle, approving. And for the first time in years, Sarah smiled freely, not from triumph, not from recognition, but from the quiet knowledge that she had endured, she had led, and she had transformed the pain of her past into power. Miller's words echoed in her memory. You don't have to carry it alone. And in that moment, she didn't. She was whole, unbroken, and unstoppable.